Beetle. Scene then shifts to Apocalypse, where Darkseid and the Phantom Stranger are continuing their tete-a-tete. Phantom Stranger refuses to believe that Operation Humiliation will work, and he states that in the end, Darkseid's devious plan to destroy Earth's heroic legends will prove fruitless. And Darkseid says, well, no, you're wasting your time in arguing with me and trying to hold on to your blind faith. He says to preserve their ideals, the heroes will either have to battle the very people they profess to protect, or else allow themselves to be destroyed by them. Either way, Darkseid wins. On the final page, we see in a hospital room in Gotham City, Jason Todd is still heavily bandaged, and he's watching the news, and he just reflects on how bad it's gotten since he was attacked and hospitalized. And despite his pain, despite his wounds, he gets out of his hospital gown, puts on his Robin costume, leaves the hospital. He's got casts on both his right arm and his right leg. He's lumbering along on a crutch, but he's going out to do whatever he can to help, even if it kills him. And back on Desolate Apocalypse, we see Darkseid laughing away. All right, time to get into the Cole's notes on this issue. First off, looking at the cover, perhaps less provocative than last month's cover with the heroes burning in effigy, but still a pretty impressive cover here, one that no doubt made a number of readers say, finally, having felt cheated in that Captain Marvel showed up in issue number 1 and then was quickly put out of commission by the end of that same issue. Here he is. Pretty tough issue to keep in mint or near mint condition given the solid black background. The first page, which is almost entirely a recap of previous events, it's not the sort of thing you see in a lot of comic books today. Writers have to work with the economy of the page. A lot of comics today are down to 20 pages at most. And given that there are artists who want to produce 1 or 2 page splashes, it's really hard for writers to say, okay, I'll devote a page to a flashback. But of course, this was written 30 years ago, in a time before digital comics. Comic book stores were still in their relative infancy, I'd say. People were still going to newsstand, going to the spinner rack, and so DC and Marvel couldn't take it for granted that people would have monthly subscriptions or would be able to stay current. So a near complete one-page flashback at this time was considered appropriate and something necessary. And just good to get readers up to speed given how much had gone on in the first 4 issues. Again, Lisa Sutton is our point of view character. She's somebody who's close to one of the heroes without knowing who he really is, but she helps give us a sense of what it's like in this world right now, what the climate is like. Now, looking at Billy Batson transforming back into Captain Marvel. In the pre-crisis era, the concept behind Captain Marvel was that Billy Batson and Captain Marvel were 2 separate personalities who basically exchanged space in the physical universe. And going back to the original Captain Marvel stories in the 1940s, there were stories in which Captain Marvel would say things like, "Oh, Billy, what were you thinking there?" Or "Thank you, Billy, that was good thinking." There were at least a couple of stories in which Billy Batson, Captain Marvel, actually got to speak with each other. But for the post-crisis era, things would change for Billy Batson and Captain Marvel. I want to say it was Roy Thomas who was the first to explore the concept that Captain Marvel was actually Billy Batson, aged physically to adulthood, and was accessing powers such as the wisdom of Solomon to make him sound like he was much older than he really was. And then Jerry Ordway would pick up this ball and really run with it in the Power of Shazam series. And it's a concept which lasted throughout the pre-Flashpoint era. Jeff Johns used this concept to a good degree in JSA, where Billy Batson was in the proverbial driver's seat as Captain Marvel, and people looked at him and thought, well, I'm looking at a grown man, so this is a grown man. And there was a great story arc between Captain Marvel and Star Spangled Kid / Stargirl, in which the two of them were becoming closer together. And in Billy's mind, this was okay because as Billy, he was very close in age to Stargirl. But for others like Jay Garrick, it made them feel quite uncomfortable. And so it all really goes back to Roy Thomas and perhaps even issue 5 of Legends here. At the start, it seems like Captain Marvel is still a separate personality from Billy Batson. As he says, for better or worse, I'm back. But then on page 4, when he says, now that I have the wisdom of Solomon again, makes it sound like it's Billy who's gotten that back. And then again on page 4, when Captain Marvel says, holy moly, going back to pre-crisis era, Captain Marvel was the big red cheese. He was the incredibly nice, gentlemanly character. But in the post-crisis era, hearing a grown man say something like, holy moly, that might lead one to think, okay, maybe this isn't really a grown man. Maybe this is a child who's been supernaturally aged to adulthood. In any event, some interesting food for thought here with Captain Marvel's reappearance here in issue number 5. Really neat structure in the first little over half of this issue, in that Dr. Fate appears to each of the heroes, and after he calls them by name and says, you are needed, we get the words, and he is gone, or, and then she is gone, or, and then they are gone. Really nice callback to the first couple of issues, at least, of Crisis on Infinite Earths, when the Monitor sent Harbinger out to collect all of the heroes one by one. Certainly a nice little throwback here for readers who had finished reading Crisis on Infinite Earths a few short weeks or months ago. Looking at the confrontation between Black Canary and the Laser League, something I should point out here is that the Laser League, Sunspot, who we'll be talking about in a minute, as well as the muscle-bound villainess from issue number 4, Emma Sue, aka Ms. Magnificent. These were characters who were all created for Legends, and these were the only appearances they made in the DCU. And good on John Ostrander and Len Wein for doing this. It helped to show the larger scope of the post-crisis DCU. It's very easy these days to be cynical and to say, well, the DC universe is populated only by A-list villains like Lex Luthor and Joker, because that's all we see so much of the time. And that's not true, of course. The DCU in any era has been populated with a wealth of villains. But really good to see here in this storyline that was designed to set out the size of the post-crisis DCU, that there were these D, E, F, maybe even Z level villains who were also there to be a thorn in the side of the heroes. Now, as for Sunspot, he was actually created as something of a dig against Marvel's editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter. Jim Shooter had created a new character. I want to say he was called Kenneth Coleman. He went by the name the Star Brand. Jim Shooter was also creating something called the New Universe, and so Sunspot's visual appearance, his costume here, it's a little bit of a callback to Shooter's Star Brand. And I don't think this was a dig by Ween or Ostrander. I think this was from John Byrne, who no doubt had some issues with Jim Shooter prior to his leaving Marvel and going over to DC to revamp Superman. Should also point out here that Guy's making a number of different constructs here, and that really stands out compared to especially the Green Lantern Rebirth era in the mid-2000s, wherein Jeff Johns wrote a piece of dialogue for Hal Jordan where Hal reflected that Guy's emerald energy just spewed out of his ring like water from a firefighter's hose. And here it's interesting to see the degree of control that Guy has, where he's creating things like a sitting chair, a pitcher of lemonade, an ornate table here. Jumping ahead to the scene with Blue Beetle. Again, just to give readers a sense of the fact that this post-crisis universe was composed of a number of characters from across the former parallel Earths. Also really neat to see Blue Beetle's movements here, an emphasis on the feet, his leg work. That's all a nice callback to Steve Ditko, who created the Ted Kord Blue Beetle. Now, as for that moment where I sighed during the synopsis, this is the scene with Batman in Gotham City, where he talks about how he always wanted the people to fear him. Batman Year One was just coming out at this point. I mean, we know today that in order to have a tighter continuity within a shared universe, writers across all the titles really need to communicate with each other weeks, months in advance. And so I'm sure that based on what they were hearing about Batman Year One and Frank Miller's plans to revamp Batman's origin for the post-crisis era, Ostrander and we were probably thinking that Batman was somebody who was going out to make everybody fear him. But after Year One wrapped up and things went back to the present day in issue number 408 of Batman wasn't someone who was going out to scare everybody. He was certainly, as he always did in the pre-crisis era, going out to terrify criminals, and no doubt to scare off would-be criminals. But I never got the sense that the post-crisis Batman was somebody who was out there to drive fear into everyone. And so seeing that line is something which sticks in my craw today. But again, I'm looking at this story with